Welcome to Beyond the Code, the podcast where industry experts and brilliant legal minds discuss the impact of new emerging technologies. I'm your host, Yitzi Hammer, a lawyer and tech enthusiast. Join us as we explore the legal, regulatory, and ethical issues surrounding AI, blockchain, and more. Get ready to go beyond the code and stay ahead of the game. Jacob, welcome to Beyond the Code. It's a great honor to have you here on the podcast. Most of my audience will already know who you are, but if you're living under a rock, Jacob Robinson is a Canadian lawyer, and more importantly, he is the host of the Law of Code podcast, which is like the penultimate podcast for showcasing lawyers, regulators, and entrepreneurs who are involved in the blockchain space. And more recently, you've also added like a solo casting side to things where you give highlights and overviews of various briefs and memos that are important for this space. I can't recommend your podcast enough. I know I've done it numerous times on social media. I feel very fortunate to have been featured as one of the guests in over the over 100 episodes that you've had so far, alongside with other, well, really any of the greats in crypto. So first of all, thank you for your tremendous contribution to this space. Second of all, keep up the good work. Third of all, this is really fun having you on the flip side of things. And just to be kind of like mean and also have a little fun, I think we should start with the place that you always start with your guests by asking you, what was your Genesis block?
I love it. Well, thanks, Yitzi. And I do want to say it's an honor to be here and grateful for the opportunity as well to speak with you. I really enjoyed the first conversation that we had on air for the podcast. And that was a lot of fun. And thank you for the kind words and support throughout the years as well. It's really meant a lot to me. As for my Genesis block, I recall the first time I was introduced to crypto, I remember thinking that, I'm not surprised a couple friends of mine have lost significant amounts of money back in 2017 when they were buying as things were reaching a peak, and various ICOs and even ETH and BTC had hit their all-time high at that point and gone down significantly. But it was shortly after where I began to learn a bit more about the technology. It really wasn't until I was in law school, though, and I took the first blockchain and the law course in Canada. There were about 10 other students in the class. I think it was open for 30 students to register. And this was before the 2020, 2021 time where blockchain really re-entered the discussion. This was 2018, 19. And I remember just listening to the teacher and thinking, oh, this is an interesting technology. I should try applying this to every paper I write in every other class. And I couldn't believe that the technology could be used in arenas like entertainment, in sports, obviously in contract drafting, but in construction. And I started to see the myriad applications of this technology and realizing that this is so much more than magical internet money or a replacement for gold, or even, frankly, just smart contracts that can self-execute. And from that time, I remember thinking and looking around the classroom, being like, wow, this is really going to revolutionize the world, but most people don't realize it yet. And so for the papers I was writing, I began reaching out to lawyers, people like yourself, trying to understand a bit more about the technology and get their quotes for my papers. Of course, lawyers' time is very valuable. And so I found when I told them I actually had a podcast, it was much easier to have that initial conversation. And then that slowly snowballed into the Law of Code podcast.
Who is your first guest?
My first guest was actually my professor in that blockchains and the law course, Professor Kienif, who he was so passionate and so great in explaining the technology, but also level-headed and realistic rather than just a Bitcoin maxi or someone who would have put me maybe down a wrong path. And so I found he was a great resource for me. And really, it was awesome of him and nice of him to be willing to be that first guest.
And what was it like growing the podcast? I mean, I having listened to some of the people that you interviewed, I kind of just always assumed you were like this like old seasoned lawyer. But then I was I was checking out your profile on McCarthy Trella, and I saw that you're actually just fairly recent to join the bar, which kind of shocked me because you must have amassed so many hours of accumulating blockchain legal knowledge across various jurisdictions with the people that you interviewed. What must that have felt like for you, being like initially a student and then like a very junior associate, interviewing all these greats and being the person to showcase their experience to the world?
There's two sides of it. I think on one side, extreme gratefulness and shock. It's always amazing to me when seasoned lawyers and people who I so admire say they listen to the podcast or they like the podcast. And it's something I never expected to happen. I didn't know what would have gone on with this podcast. And so the fact that lawyers whose time is so valuable take an hour, hour and a half, sometimes 3 to 4 hours to sit with me, research, discuss, and share their stories from best practices on the legal side of crypto. Something I'm so grateful for, frankly, and it still amazes me to this day. But the second side of it, frankly, is quite a bit of imposter syndrome where, yeah, I am relatively junior in my career. And while I have spent, and I do spend countless hours preparing for the podcast and staying up to date on things, I am speaking with people who are often 25 times or 20 years my senior, and they know things that they consider table stakes that I might not be too familiar with. And at the beginning, I would feel pressure to not ask questions that I thought might be dumb or everyone listening might know. And that's been something I've spent a lot of time working on, is to be able to say, well, if I have this question, there's a chance someone else has this question too. And it gives me a bit of an out in that I can ask it because I'm still at a junior stage in my career, but there is a slight ego hit, and it is difficult sometimes to always be speaking with people who expect you to be at least 4 or 5 years into your career, and I have to say, well, I'm still learning and I'm still figuring these things out, to level set rather than just plow along, because I don't want to give people the wrong impression, but I do think it's been an amazing learning opportunity, and a bit like having my own personal blockchain law course that I've been creating through conversations with people like yourself.
So I think, probably just to sum it up, like humility is key, right? Like being able to come at this with like the understanding that you don't know everything, and you could really learn from everybody, certainly when they're 20x experienced. um from my own perspective, like I was, I'm not like I don't have decades under my belt, but I thought I was like a fairly seasoned lawyer, as far as tech and commercial law is concerned. But when I decided to kind of like jump head in with blockchain, I didn't know the first thing about the regulatory frameworks. At least I didn't know the regulatory side. I understood it very much from a technical perspective and from a commercial law perspective, but when it came down to understanding regulation, which is so important in emerging markets and specifically vis-a-vis blockchain, I started asking around and Googling, and you were the number one resource that came up. I mean, I think that says a lot about, and I think it must have been early at the time, maybe 10 or 15 episodes in. But you're in Canada, I'm in Israel. I think like it speaks volumes for the quality of content that you were putting out, that you were still featured as like the number one resource for somebody coming into blockchain regulation. And again, I all I could do is sit here and applaud. You've done a tremendous job, and I love watching it to continue to evolve. Tell me, what is your favorite episode?
Ooh. Well, obviously the episode with you, Yitzi. I think I think for me though, one I
What's your
definitely
favorite
don't have a favorite.
conversation? Favorite conversation?
Yeah, and this will sound a bit of a cop out, but I have enjoyed every single conversation tremendously. It's taught me everything. The one I think that I was most surprised to have was the conversation with Commissioner Peirce, and she is fantastic. That's SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce, for those who aren't familiar. She's a Republican commissioner who was nominated, I believe, by Trump, by the Trump administration, and she's played a large role, and she's nicknamed Crypto Mom. And I've always been a fan of how she approaches policy. And it was something where I always thought to myself, "Oh, it'd be amazing to have her on the podcast," but I didn't think it was realistic. And then I'd connected with someone who was working with her or had worked with her, and he said that she would be more than open to it and to reach out. And so I reached out to her team, and they were kind enough to set up a date. It was 4 months in advance. Typically, I do 1 or 2 weeks in advance, but of course, with someone like her, you have to do it in advance. And so it was a great chance for me to see how someone like her thinks about this industry firsthand, ask her the questions that I had been curious about, and a conversation that when I started the podcast, I never could have pictured happening.
It's definitely one of my favorite episodes as well. I mean, it was particularly interesting to hear her speak at such face value. Really, like it felt like a very personal conversation. Um, what are your plans for the future with the pod? I know as your career develops, it's probably harder to, maintain a side gig. But I wonder, like to what extent the podcast has assisted you in your career as well, and where you're thinking on taking it going forward.
Whenever I speak to law students, I always jokingly tell them to start a podcast about the industry they're interested in because it's been the single most impactful thing of my career, from being able to have conversations like this and getting speaking opportunities, but also even the current job I'm in. The reason I had the job is largely due to the podcast and the people that I've met throughout, and them introducing me to people in the legal industry, inbound client work. It's really unbelievable to me how many opportunities, and I'm really grateful for that. And so I think it's it's been fantastic for building a legal career. It does take quite a bit of time, and it does take away from things like writing. I'm not as active in terms of writing as I'd like to be because, between getting the podcast recorded, finding guests, writing questions, re-recording things, editing on the back, you know how it is. It takes quite a
Yeah.
long time to put podcasts together. In terms of the future though, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts if there's anything you think would be interesting to build on, or any tips on making the podcast better, because to me it's such like the goal is to make it as useful for people navigating the legal side of crypto as possible, because it is such a gray area and does have so many impacts across the world that I'm trying to think of ways to make it more valuable. And one thing that I've added, which you alluded to, is some deep dives. And I did one on the accredited investor regulations with Larry Florio, and essentially took about a 6 month period of researching and ended up with 50 to 60 pages of notes, and then condensed those into a sort of a script, but talking points, and then went through that, recorded over about a 3 hour period. And so it took an enormous amount of time, but it was really enjoyable to see actually where these rules came from, why they made sense at a particular time, where the information asymmetries were enormous. Now we've entered a new paradigm where everyone has access to similar information via the internet, almost real time information. And so now it's much easier to disseminate insider findings and keep people on a level playing field. So maybe this monetary based distinction between accredited and non accredited investors isn't the best way to go forward. And so I think episodes like that have been really enjoyable. It's hard for me to get a sense of how valuable they are to people, but would love to hear your thoughts, Yitzi. I mean, you're building a podcast. Are there things that you found particularly valuable about legal podcasts?
Far as where I think you should focus your efforts, or not focus your efforts, but what I think are, are valuable tools. I think what you've done in taking, let me backtrack. In our industry, as lawyers, specifically in these emerging markets, you really need to keep your finger on the pulse and be constantly up to date on new papers that are coming out, new procedures from various courts, new proposed legislature. Like there's so much. I know we chose to be lawyers, so we knew what we were getting into, but there's really like a lot to keep up on. And every once in a while, like some huge case will come out or some new law, and I'll say like, oh, this is super important. Like I'm going to put this on the side until I have a chance to like really sit down and deep dive into it. And then you know what it's like until you actually have the time. I've got 4 kids who I love them to death, but they drive me absolutely crazy. Like until I have the time to sit down and like really focus on reading and internalizing the impact of these papers, I don't really get around to it.
Yeah.
At the same time, I spend a lot of time in the car and I listen to a lot of audiobooks. So I think there's real value in taking those. key papers, laws, or proposed bills. And, even just like a dry reading with summaries and key points, and even maybe bringing them on somebody to read it together with you and have a conversation on the document. I think that that's an invaluable resource for people within the industry who need to stay up to date and don't always have the time to sit down. It's very niche, but
Mhm.
it's definitely something. I mean, we're already in a niche market, so I think that there's definitely like a lot of value in that for people like myself and the other, I don't know, 100 or so crazy idiots like me chosen this industry to be the one that they focus their efforts on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think so too. And I mean, that's something I've done a little bit more recently with, I did one with the Coinbase brief that they filed in
Hmm.
regards to their motion to dismiss the SEC's lawsuit. And I think it's a great point because the best thing to build is something that you want to exist. And I would love to have audio versions of a lot of the papers that are out there because frankly, even if you do read them, it's a nice to have a refresher and a resource that you can use on your commute and something like that.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from you. Okay, so you have the podcast and you have the opportunity to talk to people about, various regulatory frameworks and legal processes within this industry, and then you have your other hat being a Canadian lawyer, a Canadian blockchain lawyer, rather. Um, Canada isn't exactly like number one on the map as far as crypto is concerned, but maybe it is, and I just don't know enough about it because they're not making as much noise as the U.S. is. What's it like to be a Canadian blockchain lawyer? Like, what's the crypto ecosystem like in Canada? What's the regulatory framework like? What does your day look like? What kind of what is what where is the majority of your work being focused?
Mhm. So there's two main areas that are constant themes in the work. The first is the securities regulatory side, and that's
Hmm.
largely where my practice has focused over the past year, which is depending on the project, obviously, things like registering with Securities Commission. We have 13 provincial and territorial securities regulators across Canada. We don't have like one governing body like the SEC. And securities regulations played a large role when it comes to token issuance, when it comes to platforms that are providing services, and when it comes to things like stablecoins, which our regulators have said they consider to be a security or derivative. They've sort of taken the position that it could be either. And whether that is a legally binding position, an enforceable position, is still to be seen. It hasn't really been challenged, but rules have been put in place where uh, not just centralized platforms, but exchanges and platforms that are making available this security or derivative now have to come in and register. And our regulator is much less confrontational, frankly. That's why we get so many less headlines. So back in 2021, in April, or in March, the Canadian Securities Administrators, which is a group of securities regulators in Canada, which come together to issue things like staff notices, they came out and they said, hey, crypto asset trading platforms, we think our regulation applies to you. Here's what you need to do. Step one is come in and speak to us. And so most platforms in Canada came in, spoke to the regulators, and actually ended up either registering as a restricted dealer, which is a bespoke sort of creation that they've made for crypto platforms. But then there were four platforms that didn't come in and didn't speak to regulators and didn't register. And those platforms were subsequently fined. Their profits in Canada were disgorged where it was possible. And two of them were banned from participating in Canada. So, from a platform side, we've seen some enforcement action. It's been much quieter and much less sort of hostile than we've seen in the US. From a project side and a token issuer side, rules similar to private placement exemptions and prospectuses and other requirements there apply. It depends on the project, obviously, and how the token's issued. And so we're still very much in a gray area in that regard when it comes to just what exactly is an investment contract. We've seen some enforcement actions brought against cases where it's obviously fraud. And so securities is one aspect. And then the second aspect is the AML, the KYC concerns, and that largely stems for whether or not the business is a money service business. And so, whether or not something is a money service business depends on what the business does and whether or not the main purpose is transacting and affecting transactions of digital currency or of any sort of currency. And so that's always another it depends test that we run. And I primarily focus on the securities regulatory side, but it is an important analysis because there are criminal punishments and criminal sort of liability for running an unregulated money service businesses, and those rules will come into place next year. But currently there are rules that apply to money service businesses that are dealing and allowing transactions in virtual currency. It's not, in my opinion, sufficient to cover every aspect of digital currency. So if you're offering services, it may or may not apply to you. But those are the two major areas that we've seen regulators go after. And of course, underlying everything is the lack of access to banking, which people speak about so often in the
That
US.
was my
That's
next question.
definitely a big problem here as well.
So most of your clientele, though, are they're Canadian persons or Canadian companies.
Uh, our clients range, frankly. It's quite
I'm saying people aren't coming to Canada to set up companies in the crypto space, or
There's
are they? I don't know.
yeah, you'd be surprised at how many global players have come to give a pre-registration undertaking, which is something that was mandated to basically say that they'll abide by the rules while they offer services until they're
Mhm.
registered as restricted dealers. And then once they're registered as a restricted dealer, that's typically a 2-year registration, and then they graduate to IROC or CIRO, it's called now, which is what CoinSquare has, which is the where they can start offering margin and leverage and derivatives and maybe traditional equities. And so we've seen Canadian players go through the registration process, and the Canadian CoinSquare entity is the only one to be in Zero right now. But we've also seen players like Coinbase give pre-registration undertakings, Kraken, and many, many others in the crypto space that are international players that are sticking around in Canada. We've also seen some leave. Binance is probably the most publicly recognized platform that has left Canada over the past year. I'd turn that. I'd love to turn that to you though, Yitzi. I mean, have you guys? Has there been platforms that have left Israel, and what are there rules in place there that would lead to something like that happening?
Um, Platforms don't really set up shop here. Like all of the, not all, or I would say 99.9% of the Israeli entrepreneurs or Israeli companies that are active in this space have zero interest in the Israeli ecosystem for numerous reasons. First of all, we're a very small country. The user base here is very small, and in addition, our regulators have chosen to either completely ignore the crypto industry or just take random punches at it. And even worse than that is the banking situation here. There is almost zero chances of being able to bring crypto, convert crypto into fiat and off ramp to an Israeli bank. I mean, I say zero. It's not zero because if you bought on a regulated exchange and it went into a custodial wallet and it stayed there for X amount of time, and then you went brought it back to your bank, then you could probably make your way out. But if there was anything else along the way, if it touched anywhere else, even one hop, forget about it. They'll just shut down your account and they'll never speak to you again. So it makes it very, very difficult to conduct business here because of the local banks, because of the local regulators. And like I said, it's not a large enough um, country for there to be enough business here to begin with. So we do have a very, very active local crypto ecosystem. We've got like events going on all the time. We have a lot of people who are building, developing, and trading in this space. But again, they're looking towards once upon a time North America. Now with the regulators in the U.S. behaving the way they are, unfortunately that that ship has sailed. But still, there's all of Asia and Europe and plenty of other markets where people are focused on. What's the banking situation in Canada? Like, to the extent that you have a Canadian entrepreneur who made a killing off of, in I don't know, once upon a time, an NFT project, okay, and wants to bring that money home and live off of it in Canada, how could he do that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned an NFT project just because I there's been a few that I've been speaking with, and one of them. I won't name them, but they've said that when when they're working with the bank, it's much easier to represent yourself as a software company. And the second the word crypto comes into the lexicon and the conversation, there becomes issues. And these are mandated
100
by
100%.
regulated, right? Like it's just an almost it's regulation by burden, essentially,
Yeah,
by the burden being, the compliance burdens being so much higher for particular entities that it's not worth it, frankly, for a lot of the big banks. And so what we've seen with some platforms and clients who are, I mean, going through the regulatory process with Ontario Securities Commission, the level of due diligence that the commission does, and enforcement and everything in that regard, you would think it would be relatively safe to get banking. But it's unbelievable to me how often they have to turn to credit unions and other sort of trusts and non-traditional banking entities in order to get access to liquidity and to the payment rails that they really need for on and off ramps. And I know that when Silvergate went down, losing those payment rails was a significant problem, frankly, for most of the crypto platforms in terms of banking access. And they're starting to go through other banking partners now, and non-traditional banking partners. But it's a big issue, and it's something that I think you don't realize how important access to banking is until you start to see things like this. And this isn't novel to crypto as well, right? This happened in the cannabis industry as well in its early days, and it's happened in other industries over time too. And that's why there was Operation Choke Point 2 1.0 that was found out to be happening years later. And I think, I don't know whether or not that's happening now at that widespread of a level, but it is disappointing and disheartening. But also, frankly, I think an opportunity to build another system. They say necessity is the mother of all creation. And I think this is a good opportunity for a new paradigm to be built in a way that's more accessible and less selector, or less, I don't know what the right word would be, but much less, much more accessible, really, to everyone in the industry.
I don't blame the banks, so to speak, because they're not they're not in such an easy position themselves. I heard one of the head of compliance at one of the banks here in Israel say it like this: we're a for-profit company. In the end of the day, we're looking at how we can make the most money out of our customers. And when you come to me with your whatever, maybe it's like a few $1 million in crypto, and you tell me, let me bank with you, whatever, what do I stand to gain from the fees that I'm going to get from you? I don't know, a few $1,000s here or there. Whereas the fines that I may potentially be looking at if your money isn't kosher are,
Yeah.
millions, and not to mention the reputational damage and the issues that I'll have to have going down the line dealing with regulators once I drop the ball once. It's not worth it for me to bank you here. So that's why I don't fully blame the banks. I think that the regulators need to be more forthcoming in giving the banks guidance as to how they could deal with these types of companies and services. But it's definitely like a real challenge, if not the challenge, at least in Israel, as far as um, you know, growing products, continuing to service the market. If you can't live off the income that you made, it just it makes it all that more difficult. Tell me about DAOs. Is there a DAO framework in place in Canada?
Yeah, we haven't seen too much in terms of DAOs. There was one case in Quebec, I believe, that I just want to I'll mention. But one thing I want to touch on, though, with the banking side, and you mentioned how you feel for the bankers, and I do as well, and same with regulators. Frankly, it's difficult industry to regulate, to write rules for. There's a reason why we both have podcasts and we talk to people, because there's so much to talk about, and to be the one writing rules is quite a responsibility. But when it comes to banking, I think there's this fear that isn't always justified. I think in cases of stablecoins where you could have events that really drain liquidity and don't fit well with a fractional reserve type of style banking, where you can actually cause significant issues. And we saw something along those lines with Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank, but that was partially due to the bank's management of the funds. And so I think the banks being willing to take those on should see some benefit, and it does have to outweigh the costs. But it is, to me, it does seem almost a fundamental right of a business to have access to payment rails, to be able to pay employees and to hold funds. And when you cut that access off, it's very interesting to see how quickly liberty and things that are almost fundamental rights become constrained.
Absolutely. In Israel, it's it's actually even worse because you have like various tracks. Each regulator and each banking authority has a different, completely different approach to crypto, right? The AML authority will say we can't touch your money because it's tainted, and then you'll have the banks which will say, well, the regulators won't give us a clear answer, so you can't bring your money here. And then you'll have the tax authority who says you made money, you need to pay taxes, and they'll just send you a bill for whatever you made in crypto, but you need to pay it in fiat. And the bank knows that you have no way of bringing that money in, but they don't really care. As far as they're concerned, you made money, you pay taxes. So they're not working in tandem, and it's like almost like it could drive you crazy because you say, like, who do I speak to here? I speak to you. You tell me I don't care where you get the money from. You speak to the bank tells you you're not paying it through here. So it puts you in a very difficult position, and it ultimately it incentivizes people um, to evade taxes, to find alternative solutions, to set up offshore structures, and it's not good for anybody. It's not good for clients. It's not good for governments. It's not good for banks. There needs to be more clarity, more regulation. I mean, I think regulation is a good thing. I know that like a lot of people are scared of it, but I think that ultimately we need rules in order to know how to play.
Yeah, I completely agree. And in order to protect consumers and build confidence in the market, it's always amazing to me how much has been built in crypto, considering not only the lack of regulation, but the lack of clarity, and how so many projects now which don't intend or don't promise any particular value, but people are so interested in the technology and frankly interested in speculating that they reach exorbitant evaluations based on very little substance. And the fact that that's happening makes me really excited for when we see things like Mika be built out and other ways that we can actually build things around the world that have value and provide solutions to problems that exist. And just to talk about DAOs quickly, I mean, to me, DAOs are a very difficult thing to pin down because there's so many variations. You have, DAOs in name only. You have DAOs where there's groups of, say, 99 people who form an LLC and then call themselves a DAO. And then you have a DAO that acts as a governance body essentially for particular protocols. There's just so many ways that we've seen DAOs evolve. And then there's groups of people who just launch a token and call it a DAO. And that's what happened. That was the one case that we've seen in Canada back in 2018 with a entity called Unite. And they had a website that was soliciting public investment um, into purchasing their Unite tokens. And they represented that they were a DAO. And they said, because we are a DAO, we don't need to be incorporated, we don't need to be regulated, and we're not governed under Canadian legislation, which obviously we know all those things to not be true. And then from the decision, the court basically said, look, they're not selling governance tokens. They're just trying to raise money for this entity that they're building. They have no known business. They're not registered. They're not following any of the rules that apply to legal entities or businesses or unincorporated associations in Canada. Therefore, we're going to deny them the ability to raise funds from Canadian consumers. We're going to sue them. We're going to fine them, and they're going to have to disgorge profits and any money they've raised because they've been distributing an investment contract without issuing a prospectus or relying on any of the exemptions that we have in Canada. And so this was an administrative decision from Quebec, a tribunal in Quebec. So it's not binding precedent. And so we don't have anything to point to and say, this is how DAOs will be treated. But we do know if you have a group of people and you raise money from non-accredited investors and not relying on the exemptions available in Canada, you have to issue them under a prospectus. And so if you're not doing that and your group of people, whether you call yourself a DAO, whether you call yourself anything, there's going to be consequences. And that was a good example of how DAOs are really considered to be a group of people. And depending on the structure of the DAO, like I would argue that Bitcoin is a DAO. And I've always found that the actual
Really?
DAOs don't have the name DAO in them. I mean, if you look at Bitcoin, there's no one organizer, there's no one person in charge calling the shots. It's a decentralized group of nodes, decentralized group of miners. It's autonomous because no one needs to go in and run it. It runs itself. The miners keep each other in check. And it's an organization in the sense that they are all organizing for a common purpose. And I think to me, that is truly what a DAO is. There are arguments that a
But
DAO should,
where's the governance aspect there?
and so to me, the governance aspect really is the hard forks, the miners and the nodes choose which chain to run. And so when you have something like a Bitcoin Cash event, where now there's this traditional Bitcoin chain that we're still running versus Bitcoin Cash, to me, that is how the governance voting was conducted. It wasn't the traditional democratic voting where everyone has a vote depending on a certain thing. It was, hey, if you have this amount of hash power and you're participating in the ecosystem, you have a much higher voting power, and that's what you do to affect things like a hard fork or accept certain Bitcoin improvement proposals. And so to me, it doesn't feel like a DAO, but it operates, I think, much more like what an ideal DAO would, in that there really isn't a core group of people that you're relying on to move things forward.
So it's DAO-ish in a sense. I imagine that you can make that same application to other chains, some
I
L2s
think
perhaps.
so. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the chain, but typically the more it's funny to me that the projects which don't have the word DAO in their name are the ones more likely to actually
Oh,
operate like a DAO.
there's no question that like half of the, or more than half of the quote unquote DAOs out there are absolutely not DAOs, or at least they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I'm want to say that like during the process where during the period where there was like a million NFT projects going around. So I was, either whether it was clients or just me aping into some random NFT project, I would join the Discord and then somebody would be like, "Oh, welcome to the Frog DAO," and I'd be like, "Oh crap, I'm out. I'm not, I don't want to be any part of any DAO with you." So there's definitely like an overuse of the term DAO with minimal understanding of what the legal or practical implications of that are. But it's definitely like it needs to be a factual test in the end of the day to see, are you decentralized, are you autonomous, do you operate as an organization, um,
And that's a
and
hard one too, right? I mean, where do you draw the line on what's decentralized? I think that's such a hard topic, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I haven't found a good line in the sand, because you could look at, are the nodes decentralized? If there are nodes, are the shareholders decentralized? Right? Like, just because many people own shares of Nike doesn't make the company decentralized. Just as if many people own tokens of a business, it's not necessarily a decentralized business.
it's a very very difficult question, if not the most difficult question when it comes to establishing a DAO. Right? At what point do we become fully decentralized? Well, the answer is certainly not from day one, okay,
Right.
or day two, um, and that's why you often have these companies that come along and they want to do things that are regulatorily questionable, I would say. Okay, and they're like, well, we're decentralized, so there's no liability or whatever. And I always tell them, you are not decentralized today, nor will you be tomorrow. Okay, you are going to enter a process of gradual decentralization, during which tokens are issued, people are brought onto the platform. Initially proposals are made, but the founding members have the majority of the vote. So it'd be hard to argue that these really are decentralized. But you go through a process of gradual decentralization as the platform becomes more robust, as more users come on board. And the answer as to at what point you move from being gradually decentralized to being fully decentralized, there is not one that you can answer definitively. Like it's a very gray area, and I think that's what makes crypto fun, but
Mhm.
also risky and dangerous and incredibly hard to regulate and incredibly hard to be active in at the same time. If you take a look at the U.S. regulators' behavior over the last months and year or so. It makes it very, very difficult to be active in this space. You see time and time again that whatever you thought was playing it safe, or whatever you thought was even more than playing it safe, just going above board, wasn't enough. Right? It's not enough to block U.S. IPs based on last week's CFTC actions, and it's not enough to um, to run your own Howey analysis, regardless of how well you feel you could back it up. Because in the end of the day, some regulators are going to come and make their own interpretations. So it's super, super difficult to provide definitive answers to anything in this space, making it even more difficult to be active in this space. And it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, and I think it almost, I don't know if it set the industry back, but it really threw everyone for a loop when Jay Clayton spoke about sufficiently decentralized regarding Ethereum and Bitcoin. And it conflated this idea for anti-fragility of blockchains, which is the importance of decentralization. Because when you're decentralized, there's no single point of failure. And that's where if 20% of Bitcoin nodes go offline or Bitcoin miners go offline, the chain continues and it's anti-fragile in that sense because it's decentralized. Whereas if you had a centralized platform and one of the entities went down, well, now you're in trouble. Right now you've lost the player that's controlling. And decentralization has so many benefits from not only a hardness perspective but a trust perspective as well, with things like a blockchain. What it doesn't do, though, is it doesn't give projects a right to bypass traditional regulation that would apply to them for what they're offering. And so when I talk to builders and they say to me, well, I don't think that'll apply to us because we'll decentralize. It's like, well, that's not what, like, decentralization isn't a legal concept that you can use to have laws not apply to you. Decentralization is a concept to make your blockchain and make whatever technology you're building more anti-fragile and more sustainable over the long term, but also in the hands of the community and tied in with the ethos of Web3. And I think that's something that's been conflated over the years to mean some sort of legal escape hatch or get out of jail free card, which isn't necessarily the case. It can be the case in some cases because
Almost
there's
never the
no one
case.
to serve the subpoena to, right? And it's very difficult to bring someone into court if there's no one person to talk to or to serve.
I believe somebody said that you could even serve through Etherscan, right? Etherscan and like Block Explorer have a messaging feature to them.
Yeah.
I think I heard of a case where somebody was served through the Etherscan messaging platform. But in any event, it definitely makes it harder harder to come after whoever is the owner of the wallet.
Can you imagine opening your wallet and seeing you've been
and,
served?
and seeing a subpoena. Did you read Traces in the Dark by Andy Greenberg?
No, I didn't. No.
Highly, highly,
Okay.
highly recommend. It's a phenomenal book, and
Okay.
it will give you, an insight into the law enforcement aspect of tracking down blockchain criminals. Really, really a
Okay.
phenomenal book.
And that's Tracers in the Dark?
Tracers in the Dark by Andy
Okay.
Greenberg.
Okay. Yeah, we'll
Jacob,
definitely add that to the list. Thank you, Yitzi.
this has been great. Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. The last thing that I will say is to all of our audience, if you don't already, subscribe to the Law of Code and follow Jacob Robinson on Twitter and on LinkedIn. That's JCOBROBINSON. Are there any other places that people could follow you or get more information about your podcast and about your work at McCarthy Charlotte?
I think the best way is probably Twitter or LinkedIn. And Twitter's at Jacob Robinson JD. You can find the Law of Code podcast on Apple and Spotify. Um, yeah, no, this has been fun, man. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I like the way you do this. It's a very fun conversation and thinking through things and talking through problems together. It's a nice way to start the day.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Code. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, share with your friends, and to tune in again next week for more fun and insightful conversation.